for taking the time. Appreciate it. Um, I know it's starting a bit late, but nevertheless, right, we have Corey here with us. So today we'll be talking about regs and compliance, right, Corey? We want to touch
Yeah.
base a bit on that. I don't think we'll want to delve on cybersecurity as much as I want to, but I'm not an expert on it, right? Our background has been, Corey and my background has always been with regs and compliance, right? We ran stuff for the networks pretty much for all the networks and debit networks, and some sort did some projects for FinCEN too at the same time. So actually, Corey, that was my last project before I got laid off. So it's kind of cool. What there was sanctioning Russia sanction. That's what I did
Oh,
before I
yes.
left. Yeah, so there's a big that was one of the big things that I did. And then when I went to consult for the law firm, I did some work with there for FinCEN too. So it was kind of neat. Right? So those topics are near and dear to both of us. So Corey, you want to touch base on? Let's talk about the new rules and regulations that are out there, right? With the regs and compliance, because I've been out of the loop for a bit, but I want to get your perspective. I know you're working on some government projects right now, I believe, right?
Well, now that I'm in the travel industry, I go ahead and I get to work with chargebacks and disputes that are near and dear to my heart. However, before I left Bank of America, I was heading up compliance for payment acquiring. So the regulations that we had to deal with were widely like differed wildly because we have to think about the entire ecosystem. So there's a worry about actual government laws and regulations. For instance, in the United States, you have the Treasury Department, you have still the CFPB. In addition to that, you have the FTC. There's laws that have been passed by Congress over the last few decades that all of these agencies actually go ahead and oversee. And because of, in addition to that, there's also Europe. The EU has their own laws and regulations, as well as the countries within them. For instance, the UK. Canada also has the FCAC, Financial Consumer Agency, and they actually have some of the strongest laws for payment networks and operators. So for both the banks, the networks, whether it's credit like Visa or debit networks, as well as alternative payments, this is the reason why introducing laws for cryptocurrency is so important because a lot of them right now have very little federal regulation. So that's just the first level is actual government regulation. Then, in addition, you have organizations within each of the payment industries that oversee regulation within those industries. One good example is NACHA, NACHA, which does much of the check system within the United States. So paper checks, but also electronic ACH, which is automatic clearinghouse. They go ahead and this is basically the rails for processing direct payments. And they produce a lot of the rules that govern how those direct payments go through and also the technical regulations for them. So, in addition to NHCHA, you of course have like Visa, MasterCard, um, American Express is a network all of its own, but they have rules and regulations for the merchants. Visa and MasterCard have rules and regulations for everybody, for issuing banks, for the merchants, for the processors that do transactions in between them. So that's the second level is the actual payment networks. And they produce their own rules and regulations. So far, we have government and we have the payment networks that have their regulations. Um, in addition, one more, there's also rules and guidelines that the payment networks and in addition, everybody who participates in the system agree to. So, for instance, the hardware manufacturers and the not only the networks but the financial institutions and anybody who sells the equipment. So, for instance, we didn't talk about cybersecurity tonight, but you have what's called PCI payment. I always forget the actual what the initials stand for, but the PCI Council actually goes in and establishes data security standards in the United States and North America. And those data standards actually were pretty much enshrined into law over in Europe. And they have their, in addition to normal payment regulations, privacy laws and regulations. So that's another thing we can talk about at a later point. So far, so good, Nick?
Yeah. So I forgot PCI, payment card industry.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. DSS,
It's
PCI,
it
DSS.
very
Yeah.
those standards. While a lot of participants work with it, such as Visa, Mastercard, they work with the PCI Council to go ahead and create the standards. It is a independent organization that everybody agrees to work with, so it's pretty. There's a lot of different ways that regulations can come into our industry.
Well, to me, PCI DSS is the gold standard, right? I mean, if you do not follow or comply, merchants in terms of merchants, right? I mean,
Right.
what's the fine, like $1 million and loss of um, if you can end up losing your whole account in a sense, right? Everything that you have if
Well,
you do not follow suit in a sense.
that's the exactly because payment card industry. There we go. Payment card
Yeah,
industry data security standard.
yeah.
And it's if you don't, the reason why it's created like that is that all the participants work together in order to go ahead and make the rules and regulations for PCI in order to do a comprehensive look at security.
Hmm.
Before PCI, which it's a long time ago, but there was a time before it. And when I say long time ago, I'm saying the 90s. Um, there wasn't as much focus on a lot of the data standards within the industry. Back then, there was still the full card number on receipts. There was no common, like, if you've been hacked or if you had a data breach, here's what to do. Uh, or just standards for, okay, every year, if you're a business of this size, this is what you should be doing a checklist on to make sure your network and such is secure. So this really brings up really the first thing is, where do rules and regulations come from? Well, a lot of times it's not forward thinking. It's from the pains of growth in an industry. A lot of the payment industry, for instance, that's always the way that rules and regulations come in. Good example is right now with cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency has been around for, at this point, let's say 15 years. And it's only been recently in the last 2 to 3 years that we are seeing actual regulation for the industry coming out. Matter of fact, when I was at Bank of America, this was 3 years ago, that was the first time we were getting asked for comment from federal agencies. What that basically means is that the agencies come to the different financial institutions, tell them about proposed regulation, and ask them to comment on what they think the actual, if that's fair regulation or should it be enacted or should it be changed. And for cryptocurrency, they were really asking financial institutions, what do you think regulation will look like? Are these commodities? Is it actual currency? Do you feel that it should be completely legal? Do you feel that there's a place for it in the payment industry? So that's really where rules and regulations come from, unfortunately. A lot of times it's from the pain of actual like processing and running transactions or trying to set up networks and systems. So you should always look from a perspective when everyone gets into the fintech industry of if something looks like it, even though you don't see a rule or regulation or you do a search for it, if you feel like something doesn't feel like it's operating correctly or that why are we doing it this way or does it look correct, look safe, really should we be wondering about a rule or regulation for this, because that's usually the way that rules and regulations even start to get thought of.
Okay, let's thank you for that clarification. Let's touch base on let's talk about EMVCo. But that's another governing body too, right?
Yes.
In terms of with chip card, and I also know that they delved a little bit into cybersecurity, right? And why is it important to EMVCo? Because I
Well,
promise you, we're not gonna get deep into it, but just at least on the surface,
well, the thing about EMVCo is the reason why it was set up was for security.
right? Hmm.
EMVCo, their main mission was to go ahead and create a chip standard or a standard where they could have safer card devices. So MasterCard, Visa went ahead and joined up with a group called Europay in order to go ahead and make EMV.
Hmm.
And from that start, they've have grown into an organization that all of the major credit and debit networks are part of. Um, they create a standard for the entire payment transaction flow, not only from the creation of or the creation of software and hardware for the machines, the testing, the certification for those machines, both for the manufacturer and for when they're being installed at location, the software that runs on them. In addition to the chip, they also look at things like web browsers for EMV processing. They've created card holder authentication standards. So when you're doing a transaction on a website and it says, "Hey, you're issuing bank, you have to go ahead and do this one-time password this time because we're just doing a fraud check." That's card holder authentication. They're making sure that you are the card holders doing a e-commerce transaction.
Hmm.
EMVCo created or worked with uh, a lot of the networks and also the web browser companies and such to make what's called 3D Secure, where a lot more elements than previous authentication are sent through, and you don't get that one-time password. You're not asked to put in a password or anything. Instead, it uses elements such as your browser window, IP address, uh, device, the what you call machine address, what type of device it is that's sending the transaction, where it's located, the cardholder name and address that the cardholder gave. All this information is used in order to go ahead and authenticate. And the group that helped create those standards was EMVCo. So
Hmm.
that shows that in the payment industry, unlike a lot of more traditional industries or manufacturing industries,
Hmm.
the payment industry, a lot of the rules and regulations are created at a global level, and the EMVCo is an example of that. It wasn't from one government or one especially popular network. Even though Visa, MasterCard are very much influential in EMVCo, you
Hmm.
have networks globally that use that standard. And what it does is for fintech, it creates a industry where you have a lot of standardization, even though it's a global industry. So while there are government rules and regulations that control the basics, like you have to do certain things for a consumer dispute. Of course, you can't process people who are sanctioned, so you have to have underwriting rules and regulations for that. There's standards for, which we might talk about later, how to present a surcharge at a location, or even if you can surcharge. All these things are controlled usually at a government level, or there's whole framework created at a government level. But group industry councils like PCI and EMVCO are where the actual regulations, the working language is created.
So, Corey, yeah. So, what are the best practices in place for monitoring, detecting, and reporting suspicious fraudulent activity in your organization? Where do you see that? We know how it worked at WorldPacer, but I just want to find out what's being done on your side here.
Well, that's the one thing I was going to mention, whether it's with cybersecurity or, but it also applies with compliance.
Yeah.
These are what I like to call a corporate defense. I've said it before in the past, but they are not revenue generating usually, unless you make a special program around them somehow and sell that.
Hmm.
So, the first thing is that the organization has to understand the importance of of cybersecurity, of doing this proactively and investing in it. With
Hmm.
compliance, even more so, because a lot of times compliance is actually where you're going to be told what to do as far as investing into updating and maintaining your system. So you know just as well as I do that for Visa, Mastercard, American Express, Discover, the debit networks, they have two major updates a year, but they actually have updates quarterly, depending on what region you're in. And on top of it, they have announcements they can put out at the drop of a hat. Because if the government says, hey, you have this amount of time to implement, then the networks really have no choice. They're going to have to say, here, there's this new release. You must update within the next quarter for this new rule. So, yes, our organization, it's very proactive in matters of cybersecurity and compliance, especially with compliance. A good example is right now um, that we're going ahead and entering a new market. And when entering that new market, in addition to all the things you have to worry about as far as setting up a new system, going ahead and getting all the processes done over in this country or in this market, in addition to that, you have to go ahead and register with the market, with whether it's the European Union or it's an individual country. You have to register there. You have to prove that you're following all the rules and regulations as a payment processor. You have to have the right licenses in order to go ahead and transfer money. You have to show your processes for dealing with things like disputes.
Hmm.
And all these things have to be done before you can even operate in a market. So
Oh.
right there is
Hmm.
the setup cost. And then on top of it, once you're in a market, in addition to the federal regulators, more likely you're dealing directly with the payment networks. So when they set up their rules and regulations, a lot of times they go ahead and do a check when you first join,
Hmm.
but they're operating from a thought that if you don't follow these rules, not only is it dangerous for everybody within the system, but you're going to lose a lot of money yourselves. You're going to basically, you're not going to be successful operating. Um,
Okay.
so that with that thought process, instead of saying, okay, you need to go ahead and invest in it because you can make a lot of money, or what you're doing is you're protecting the business proactively from all types, not just hacking and such like that, but just neglect. That's how a lot of disputes start. That's how you well know system negative events or system cascades happen,
Hmm.
where you don't update this one data element in October, and on December 21st, all of a sudden several clearing cycles failed because they said, well, you needed to change this by this date or else your files are not going to go through. That
Yeah.
happens because of network certificates.
Yes.
So if you don't update your certificates, we've had situations before where payment processing starts to fail. And that's just, right there. People look at it and they're like, that's so simple. That's literally your, like just the same certificate you have in web browsers and such. Yes, every network connection has a certificate that you need to update. And a lot of times, these are the type of things where people don't think, oh, well, it's not, it's just a certificate, right? Yeah, but you might have to update it across servers that have their own security protocols and don't allow you to make these changes during the daytime or with certain personnel. So, yes, it's a different mindset from sales. It's a different mindset from revenue generating product delivery, but nonetheless, it's it's mission critical to the business, both technically and in processes.
Hmm. So we talked about more on the external side. What about KYC and KYB, right? I mean, sorry, know your customer, right? How does that help reduce the compliant risk?
Well, it mitigates risk. I don't want to ever say reduce. The
Hmm.
risk is always there. What you're doing is mitigation. So think of it like one of those fun little video games, like tower defense games, where you have, hordes attacking your company. Well, you're not going to just stop the hordes. What you're going to do is you're going to build up walls in order to go ahead and defend against it.
Hmm.
So that mitigation, the way that mitigation comes in, especially with KYC and KYB, is that first of all, know your customer. Um,
And know your business. Yeah,
and know
there's
your
one.
business, right? Is strict underwriting policies. This is created at a compliance level. The networks hammer home how important it is to underwrite properly.
Hmm.
Also, with applications for card holders, if you're an issuing bank or for people that work under those card holders, or for instance, a corporate account, um, every application is thoroughly checked, of course. But also, if a application's rejected, that's still held into a database, and basically the network looks at all the failed applications. So if someone's trying to use data that is, for instance, personal identified information, but it's been faked, or if they've stolen it and they're trying to use it in order to get credit card applications, that's how the network goes ahead and investigates that.
Hmm.
Um, for businesses, there's terminated merchant files and questionable merchant files that the networks basically share with each other and with all the other participants. So if a merchant is found to be a bad actor, or they're a terrible merchant and they're just going ahead and creating a whole lot of consumer disputes and have terrible customer service, if they get kicked out of the system, there's enough information that's kept, such as their directors, such as the business name, its address, where it's from, etc., where if they try to go ahead and get back into the system with a different acquirer or processor, that will come up. Um, in addition, there's very strong fraud programs within all the different networks where they are constantly checking for not only just for fraud, but also for patterns of fraud, whether someone who's trying to get into the system, the information that's being used, if it's something that they've been listed for sanctions or listed for any criminal reason, such as, for instance, the OFAC list. That's the government list for anybody who, while a country may not be sanctioned, for instance,
Hmm.
you you might be personally sanctioned from actually doing any type of business within the United States. these type of things are checked before someone is allowed to process on the system.
Yeah, that's goes under the underwriting team, right? If we have
Exactly.
merchants when on board, we go through the whole list. They
And
vet them based
and
on
then
principles. Yeah, right.
right. So KYC and KYB is really strongly handled at that part where you're going ahead and actually doing that check.
I believe if the owner is 50% and if they're under sanctioned countries, they're not
Right.
even allowed. We won't even board them. Definitely
But
not.
that just handles like that's kind of like, okay, making sure bad actors don't get in the system. In addition to that,
Yeah.
they do go ahead and also just look at the way that the merchants actually process. So they will, for instance, Visa and MasterCard, actually all the networks encourage looking at a merchant's previous history, their previous dispute history, how their bank accounts have been running, who's the directors in the company, and looking at various factors to determine not just if they're a bad actor, but let's say a merchant tries to join up, but they operate a cigar shop. Well, networks know because of the legality of selling only to people who are of age, because of the cigarette industry, the divisiveness of it, the reputational hit, they've considered that a high risk business. In
Hmm.
addition, gambling, adult content, digital cyber lockers where you can transfer files for piracy and such like that, options trading, foreign exchange trading. Right now, cryptocurrency sale, believe it or not, all these things are considered high risk. And what that means is that regulations deem that there's even more controls that you have when you're trying to either sign one of these businesses or process with them. Pharmacies are high risk business, not because of that they're selling, well, because they're pharmacies. So you have to make sure that they are licensed properly, that they are following the state regulations, that they are not going ahead and, for instance, delivering without doing certain checks and such. So this is why companies such as any acquirer out there that you can think of, or the banks themselves, like Bank of America and such, they have compliance not only for internal compliance, they have a regulations group usually, regulations and internal compliance. Then they have compliance for their actual processing divisions. There's various places within an organization where you're going to find compliance.
All right. Do we have any questions? Well, in the midst of it, I just want to pause for a second and ask you if any questions or anything interesting you want to mention here. The crowd's kind of quiet today.
Yeah, very quiet. I will go ahead and because I mean it makes a little bit more sense when you bring it down to like your day to day. One of the biggest things in compliance over the last few years has been, at least for payment processing, is a surcharge. If you go to a business of any type, if you go online and you make a payment to, for instance, paying the electric bill or something, most likely you're going to see a surcharge, unfortunately. And that's something that's been argued about for, believe it or not, the last 50 years. But to go back to like recently, it's become a much bigger issue because a lot of businesses, especially after the pandemic, started doing surcharges out of nowhere, just saying, hey, if you come into our business, for instance, we're going to charge extra 6% in order to cover credit card processing. Well, that's actually against the rules that Visa and MasterCard had created due to a settlement from the Department of Justice, I believe in 2011. And in addition to Visa, MasterCard, all debit networks agreed to this language because debit cards aren't actually allowed to be surcharged. So after the pandemic, when a lot more businesses started doing these surcharges because they were saying they're trying to go ahead and mitigate for higher prices, higher processing, and such, a lot of them just did it in a way that's completely illegal. And while what we're seeing is that a lot of government agencies, a lot of attorney generals have actually started suing for this. For instance, in New Jersey, they had a county government end up being sued by the state government because they were surcharging on tax payments. So we're seeing these. This is where compliance kind of unfortunately, collides with the regular world, because at this point, Visa has started to especially go ahead and enforce their rules on surcharges. Believe it or not, if you go to a business and they charge you more than a 3% surcharge, and they do it on a card where you look at the front of it, and while it says Visa, if it says debit on it, you have a good chance of informing your financial institution, calling customer service, letting them know that the business did a surcharge to your card, and that business ending up with a $5,000 fine to start. So compliance handles situations like that. They also go ahead and handle situations where, in addition to what impacts you every day, what I work with in disputes is actually from regulation from the federal government, the FTC specifically, called Regulation E. And if you look up Regulation E, E as in Edward, payment processing, then you'll see these are very basic laws where it says exactly the way that you have to handle a consumer dispute, or that you have to handle payments specifically, what you can actually charge on, what you can't. But Regulation E, and I believe Z also, becomes actual payment network regulation. Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, any of the debit networks such as NYCE or Star, Shazam, all of them create a slew of rules and standards that are based on regulations like Regulation E. So to go ahead and go back, this is everyday things or everyday laws or situations that become compliance. One recent one that I was really upset with was that they were going to the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I believe. They were going to create a rule where if a flight was canceled, then the airline had to immediately credit you. They had to do a refund rather than just going ahead and having you go ahead and just get, a flight later on or a credit or something like that. And they knocked that rule down, which was very disappointing. Another big regulation that has been in the news for a long time was, maybe you've even heard of it, but the Merchant Category Code, MCC, for gun stores. Currently, there is not an MCC for gun stores. They want to start introducing one directly for firearm sales. There was a lot of false information in the news about this. People said that the law would require tracking of every gun purchase in America. That's impossible by MCC. MCC just identifies the type of business that it is. It doesn't identify the product being sold. And at the same time, on people who are advocating for it, they were saying, well, it could stop people from selling bad weapons and such like that. And that's not the way MCC works. It just identifies the business. So what we see there is the politicization of regulations and compliance. A lot of times what looks like a very straightforward rule gets politicized, and whether it's surcharges, because that's actually a political situation, um, whether it's MCC codes that identify businesses, that became a political situation because of the gun debate, interchange fees. So the fees that merchants pay, even that is regulated. So regulations and compliance really tell you how to properly process. That's the baseline for how to be whether you're a good bank or a good merchant acquirer or a good payment network, even making the hardware for the devices. All of them come under some type of compliance.
All right.
I have a
Questions?
question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Corey, basically what I hear you saying, so do you think that it's up to like the consumer or the business to, raise these concerns so that they could start, because it sounds like they're not going to follow it unless they're penalized for it. So do you think it's up to the consumer or the business to just start calling it out?
Great question. It's up to everyone. That is one of the biggest things I want everyone here to take away when you start working in the industry. Nick can tell you, anybody in the industry can tell you, every at least quarter, sometimes depending on your position, once or twice a month, you have to do compliance training. You have to actually go ahead and learn about basic compliance throughout the business. So whereas in some businesses, people joke around about, oh, the sexual harassment training, and oh, the training on how to keep the building secure and such like that. In the fintech industry, you have tons of compliance training, and they go ahead and go over everything from, of course, hacking, cybersecurity, making sure you don't get vished, to the just simply, okay, this is what our this is our responsibility to our merchants. If they make a complaint, how we go ahead and escalate that complaint, take record of the complaint. In addition, if a card holder makes a complaint, how to handle that from the network. We get notifications from the networks because of card holders contacting their issuing bank and not doing that. It might not be a dispute. It might just be, hey, I went to a restaurant and they did surcharge me. They charged me like 20%, and they didn't say it was a gratuity. They said it was for payment processing. That complaint goes from the issuing bank to the payment network, and the payment network has a system where they go ahead and they start a formal investigation with the business, with the merchant. So not only surcharges, but minimum amounts. If you go into a gas station, they try to charge you a minimum amount. That's another thing that becomes a compliance investigation. If a merchant's having a huge amount of disputes, the network will go ahead and do that as a compliance investigation. Um, so there is active monitoring, but in addition, a lot of a lot of things where merchants are breaking rules and such, those can be reported. And yes, it does come to the network level. So I would say that it's not just on the consumer, it's not just on the merchant, it's also on the consumer's issuing bank, it's on the merchant's merchant acquirer processor, both for those sides to be proactive, not just wait for a consumer to say something. Um, I could tell you even today in my business, um, we found out a merchant had only a couple disputes, but they had a few hundred fraud reports. Well, consumers weren't disputing it because it was such low transactions that if the bank closed a card or whatever, they just took the hit. But there was still fraud going on there. So the network had to go ahead and inform them of that and say, hey, we need an investigation on this right now. Sometimes it's a lot smaller than that. At my previous acquirer, we had a certain percentage of merchants who had the incorrect time zone. Now you would think, okay, that's not a big deal. But when it comes to disputes or when it comes to transaction information and processing, having an accurate time is extremely important. So in order to fix that, the network goes ahead and does a fine, a penalty to the business. And once we saw that, okay, why are we getting fined? Well, it's because of this. Let's go ahead and make a technical schedule to get this fixed. So there are active checks on all ends, but yes, it is very important for the consumer also to protect their rights by going ahead and informing their bank of when they have an issue like this.
Good question. All right, anybody else?
I will say this. Compliance is I've said it in previously, I believe in our last FAB session, Nick. But compliance and regulation is an industry that right now is being recentered. There was a lot of focus on having compliance at the federal level, and it's being now pushed towards the industries itself, where the industries would do a lot of self-regulating. And this is to tell that everyone on this call, there's job openings. So what you want to do is go ahead and look into those organizations, like I said, like the FTC, the CFPB, even if they are, right now, they're in danger of going away, still look at the operation of the CFPB, what their actual mission statement is, the type of agendas that they actually followed. And then also look at state levels. For instance, New York State Attorney General and their work on payment regulation. California Attorney General also with their work on payment regulation. For laws such as privacy laws, data privacy, the gun regulation I was just talking about, surcharges, dual pricing, which is when you're driving down the highway and you see a gas station charge one price for credit and another price for cash. That actually comes from federal law, and it's been around for like 50 years, but there's a complete rule set around that. But all these things, you can see it from those organizations. But also in addition, look at industry, for at least payment industry organizations such as PCI, NACHA, so NACHA, EMVCO, the U.S. Payment Forum. I would say just these are a good start to look at how the industry does its own self-regulation and also what type of working councils they have, what they do in order to go ahead and regulate the industry. But I definitely would recommend to go ahead and look at these, because instead of being at a government level, when it's self-regulated, you're going to see a lot more jobs open up from workers within the industry. Companies like the one I work at, where they need their own compliance subject matter experts. So it's worth looking at. If you're going to be working in fintech, it's worth looking at compliance and how you're affected with it, but also if you're interested in it, working in compliance.
So Caleb had a question. Yeah, go ahead. What new compliance and regulations are coming out, and how do you think it will affect the industries negatively rather than positively?
You're never going to hear me say a lot of negative stuff about compliance. A lot of times, I've almost get very mad when I hear people talk about compliance slows down innovation in industries and makes it harder to operate and such. compliance done right protects the consumer, and it protects actually the businesses within the industry.
You
So
know, my saying, Corey, is to tell everybody, I know they get upset with compliance, right? When we used to do our job, I say, we are the guys that keep the lights on for y'all. You know,
right.
essentially, nobody, and everybody underestimates what we do, right? It's a pain point for them, for industries. But when done right, like exactly, we have to do this to protect the business,
So
and go ahead.
the
I'm sorry.
the biggest mainstream thing right now that's out there in the public and what you would see on the news is such as artificial intelligence, AI. And it's the fact that there is, because I mean, AI, although it's been around since the 1950s, literally, um, AI nonetheless has much less legal framework around it, at least, especially, excuse me, in the payment industry. So we've seen at a federal level that there's been initiatives to go ahead and block any regulation from a state level, which I will be blunt is just not feasible. Even in the payment industry, a lot of the regulations that are out there are at a state level, not necessarily a federal level. For instance, privacy laws are right here in the United States right now are really at a state level, specifically from California. So for I see a lot of regulations. Um, I not just are going to, but have to come from a state level, especially from New York and California. And I think that it's actually it's something where you're going to see more artificial intelligence regulation. And while people think of artificial intelligence as the Matrix or Terminator or whatever like that, artificial intelligence is simply that a machine is able to go ahead and learn certain processes automatically by itself without us intervening. So there's been artificial intelligence in the industry for quite some time, especially on fraud protection. And there is a worry that without the proper input from industry participants and with the political nature right now out there, that any regulation that's coming out might be too aggressive. So that's saying the other side of the coin is that a lot of people are worried about just being overly aggressive in the regulations. But I just saying that the states can't regulate isn't going to help. There needs to be an open dialogue without the both politics but also the hype around AI, where there's basic rules made around how a LLM or generative AI um, can be used in the industry so that it protects consumers. It doesn't allow bad practices to be hidden within automation or within black box software, but it allows the innovation that everybody wants to continue. So, to answer the question, the biggest thing I think right now that we're seeing is regulation around artificial intelligence. Before that, it was firearms. Firearms were and what happened in the since October that everything changed? Well, I'm not sure, but yes, firearm before that was the biggest topic,
Hmm.
and the regulation actually was just bad. I'm hoping that this is also revisited because, as I said before, there was a lot of people suggesting laws and regulations around the use of certain merchant category codes to indicate whether or not guns were being sold. And I can tell you just from working in the industry with other industries such as gambling or financial instruments, cryptocurrency, for instance, and such, an MCC can tell you if someone is selling a good. It can't tell you what good they sold. Or so even if you get a MCC of, like, the number code for a gun store, that just tells you it's a gun store. It doesn't tell me whether they sold a Glock beer cozy or if they sold an actual Glock. So that's the thing about using an MCC code in order to go ahead and address issues such as background checks or tracking of purchases and such. It doesn't work. But that was a lot of regulation around the MCC code being implemented so that every person or every business that sold any type of firearm would be identified. And that's been pushed to the back burner now.
All right. Thank you, Corey. Do we have any other questions? All right, folks. Thank you all for taking the time. Thank you, Corey. Appreciate
Thank you
taking
once
the
again.
time to talk to us. And have a wonderful evening, y'all.
If you're watching the All-Star game, enjoy.
Yep. Have fun. Take care. Bye.